Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Will Costanzo, and together with Nicole, we co-chair the SIG on Transnational Cinemas for the Society for Cinema and Media Studies. We have been organizing these remote conversations pretty much every month with leading scholars in our field, together with our co-conspirators on the other side of the Atlantic. I don't know, see Elle here yet, but we alternate with them. So the next month, in case you're interested, you can save the date, which will be February 22nd, a Wednesday, where Dr. Denise Soren, a visual artist and researcher at the University of Birmingham, will talk about Visual Archive of Empire. But today, it really is my honor and pleasure to introduce someone whose work I've come to admire more and more the more I read his books and his articles. And I appreciate his generosity in making time to join us. Our guest speaker is, we're going to call him Joe.
Yes, everybody calls me Joe.
I have a granddaughter with a Korean name that I can't pronounce, so we call her Winter. So we'll call you Joe, but perhaps you can pronounce your name for us briefly.
It's Joseph Jonghyun, and I always use Jonghyun because it was my birth name. I got Joseph when I was 5 years old. So, I go by Joe, and it works for my parents. Probably thought that it fits both names. So
okay, good. So Joe, as some of you know, is director of the Center for Critical Korean Studies. And in addition to that, he's a professor of English and Asian American Studies, both at the University of California in Irvine. He's the author, most recently, of Vicious Circuits, about Korea's IMF cinema and what he calls the end of the American century. And another book, earlier book with the University of Iowa, entitled Racial Things, Racial Forms, Objecthood in Avant-Garde Asian American Poetry. He is widely interested in so many different topics, and I think one of his strengths is the way he can merge these interests and bring us rather unique insights, new ways to think both about film content and film form and their relationships to culture and to economic issues. He has, I think, a unique grasp of Korean culture and Netflix culture, which he brings to his study of Korean cinema, and the kinds of stories that Netflix chooses to tell through its productions. Whether or not you've read his work, his groundbreaking work, I think you'll agree that we have a lot to learn from Joe. So begin anytime you like.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Will, and thank you to Nicole for your help in arranging this. I'm really honored to be here. I'm looking at the participant list. I'm a little taken aback. I'm a fan of a lot of the work of a lot of people that are in this room, so this is great. I shortened, I understand this piece was distributed in its longer form. I had to shorten it considerably for this presentation. I'm happy to talk about the other parts that are just sort of hinted at here. But I will say that I realized reading it this morning, shortening it, produced this effect that I was trying to avoid in the actual article. This is coming out as an article the next year, which is to make Kingdom a kind of allegory for, what's happening in Netflix and what's happening in the Korean economy. And I kind of wanted just to use Kingdom as a kind of illustration rather than this kind of, I think in the shortened version, it has a more of a tighter correspondence. And that was precisely what I was trying to avoid, but I think that's just a product of the bowdlerization. But I'm happy to talk more extensively in Q&A. So let me just get started. Oh, let me share my screen here. Let's see. Does that look okay? You can see it? Okay, great.
Yes, it looks great.
Okay, so I'll get started there. So at the climax of the second season of Netflix Korea's hit Kingdom, the crown prince Lee Chang makes a noble decision for the good of his kingdom against his own self-interest. He's become aware that the infant son of the queen consort is in reality the low-born son of his deceased personal bodyguard, and that she had contrived to steal the young boy from her mother to pretend that she'd been given birth to him. So she's trying to usurp the throne, basically. Nevertheless, Yi Chang realizes that the infant is a better choice than he for the throne, which was vacated by his father after contracting the zombie disease that occasions the show's plot. Hopefully, a lot of you have seen this show. So with the infant before him in the arms of the physician, Sobi, played by Beruna, and his advisors urging him to kill the boy, Yi Chang calmly asks, "Which of us truly deserves to die? He's a prince and the sole legitimate heir to the throne, whereas I am a beheader of my own father, a bastard son guilty of high treason. I ask you, which one of us in this war-torn, plague-ravaged country needs more?" And obviously, that's in Korean. These are all translations that I'm working with. Since no one in the room has the authority to challenge him, Prince Yi Chang answers on behalf of his advisors and by extension the people of his kingdom. Quote, "This child is the only chance this kingdom has left." End quote. So in the context of early 17th century Joseon dynasty, this is a magnanimous act of sacrifice by a prince more concerned with the future of his kingdom than in his own personal claim to the throne. But Yi Chang's assessment of what amounts to a personnel decision at the executive level has a specific resonance with Netflix's corporate culture, and that is the keeper test. This is a foundational practice of Netflix human resources stemming from the early years of the company. And the keeper test asks employees to consider, would the company be better off with someone else in my role? From the early years, Netflix operated as if the company were a sports team. And they actually say this in their sort of own press, for which personnel decisions are based on performance maximization. Netflix's distinctive corporate culture helped the company to pivot nimbly as business conditions changed, and perhaps nothing more important than maintaining this ability was the keeper test. Crucially, in the present context, why is that not advancing? Okay. Crucially, in the present context, CEO and company founder Reed Hastings has stated plainly that the principle should apply to him as well. So, in other words, all the way at the top, like the king, right? Princess Yi Chang's magnanimous act in kingdom precisely imagines this hypothetical possibility in uncannily specific terms. He applies the keeper test to himself at the very top of the hierarchy. Hastings' hypothetical removal of from CEO becomes here a decision about the best king, that is in the show. And the moment is striking because it stands in stark contrast to similar stories about power struggles and transition. I'm aware in the last week or two, Reed Hastings actually stepped down, but that's a very different, I don't believe that he applied the keeper test. This was more of a kind of retirement in the model of like Jeff Bezos stepping down. So I don't think this was, the keeper test was applied here. The history of Netflix as a company has been defined by similar pivotal moments of transition at which the fundamental identity of the company was at stake, beginning with a controversial decision in 2011 by Hastings to split off its successful DVD rental business to focus on the streaming service. Although the decision proved prescient in the short term, it led to 700,000 subscription cancellations and caused the company's stock to plummet by 70%. More recently, as the rising cost of licensing began to threaten the company's profits, Netflix invested an enormous amount of capital into content production. And this is the Netflix, right, that we know today. This pivot towards content creation was accompanied as well by an aggressive global strategy, which included Netflix Korea. Kingdom was the first original series produced by Netflix Korea, and it was a huge success, not only in the Korean market, but internationally as well. But rather than read the series according to the strictures of narrow allegory, this paper will consider, and actually the larger paper, tries to consider Netflix and Netflix culture in particular in broader terms. To this end, I want to suggest a broader definition of culture that might complicate our account of corporate culture. That is, culture in the biological sense of conditions that promote growth, as in the way a petri dish functions as culture in which microorganisms might flourish. To appreciate corporate ecology, then, we must think more broadly about the emergence of global media platforms and the cultures, indeed histories, in which they develop. Indeed, corporate culture as a narrow frame is circumscribed by larger capitalist phenomena. The larger assertion here is that culture in this broad sense cannot help but circumscribe cultural production because it is so fundamental, not just to the specific corporate culture of Netflix, but to the culture of global political economy in which it is situated. In what follows, then, I'll first consider the specific position of Netflix Korea within both Netflix's global business and in relation more broadly to Korea's specific place within a transitioning world system in the first decades of the 21st century. Actually, that's, unfortunately, that is a large part of what I had to actually cut out to make this shorter, but I'm, again, happy to talk about that in Q&A. And here I'll specifically consider the prospects for growth, both at the corporate and geopolitical and economic levels, thinking of growth in the manner of, like not unlike the manner of the sort of petri dish. Netflix culture implies a useful strategy for stamping out weaker competition amidst crisis conditions, but one that does not solve the crisis itself, a fact which becomes apparent when Netflix assumes its position as industry leader rather than a scrappy upstart. Secondly, I want to track the way in which its landmark show, Kingdom, the first original show scripted for Netflix Korea, encompasses the contradictions of imperialist logics that ramp up precisely as the foundation for that power erodes. Kingdom and Netflix more broadly imagine a world that tries to bypass this fundamental requirement, and in so doing, risk building castles in the sand, which, however elegant, become susceptible to shifting tides as Hallyu waves begin to recede. Often celebrated as the engine of the company's dramatic growth from a small startup to a global corporation, Netflix culture is actually an explicitly articulated set of homegrown corporate values established by the company and propagated through its global offices. This is the actual website. You can look. It's actually changed since I got the screen capture, but they have always had this. They're very proud of their culture, and it's very it is specifically elaborated. Sometimes it's called the culture deck as well. A point of pride, a lengthy document is available on the website describing the features in detail. For those versed in Silicon Valley human resources rhetoric, Netflix culture statement reads familiarly. It favors flattening rigid hierarchies in favor of efficient networks that empower employees to operate dexterously with tailored solutions, meeting a wide range of local challenges in a global environment. It's largely bullshit as well. It's sort of this kind of corporate hagiography, right? Hence, as articulated as late as early 2022, and this has since changed, the statement began, entertainment, like friendship, is a fundamental human need. We want to entertain the world. If we succeed, there is more laughter, more empathy, more joy. So this opening appeal towards friendship signals that deep in the DNA of this entertainment company is a social network ethos. Friendship here is like a friend in Facebook, less the site of personal intimacy and more a point of contact in an ever-expansive network that connects the individual to the world. Consuming media on its platform becomes akin to social interaction, which aspires ultimately for breadth of reach more than it does for depth of connection. There actually used to be years ago a friend function on Netflix, which is no longer there, but it just reflects that this was a sort of an important kind of principle in thinking about the development of the company. The logic, of course, here is tautological, and here the recurring adjective is in more laughter, more empathy, and more joy. I think the adjective is more important than the nouns there. Is of greater is of greater import than the nouns they modify. This is a growth culture oriented toward the growth of its culture. Its general rhetoric of egalitarianism notwithstanding, corporate culture at Netflix is above all strategic, and its emphasis on freedom. So this is one of the key terms of Netflix corporate culture, is freedom and responsibility. Freedom simply names its central tactical orientation. This is a freedom born not of pure enthusiasm for the creative imagination, but rather is a rational reaction to crisis conditions, most immediately in the traditional film and television businesses, in which slow and indecisive responses have disastrous consequences. Because of its ambitions for rapid and widespread global expansion, Netflix cannot afford to be too centralized, needing to adjust on the fly as they move into unpredictable regional markets, including Korea. Local and regional producers and executives are required to make fast decisions to take advantage of the narrow opportunity windows. And Netflix culture thus instills this organizational principle to provide guidance for what can be very kind of entropic operations. So founded in 1997, Netflix began not exactly as a new economy business rooted in network infrastructures, but as a DVD subscription company, successful in disrupting the once profitable brick and mortar video rental business, as most prominently manifested by Blockbuster Video. Netflix initially utilized not a high-tech distribution apparatus, but rather that more old-fashioned network known as the US Postal Service, thus relying on an infrastructure that Netflix did not own. This becomes a kind of common theme throughout the history of Netflix, that it relies on an infrastructure that it does not own. In fact, Netflix was once the US Postal Service's single largest client. So though instantaneous distribution of online streaming may seem worlds away from the far slower delivery times of the original mail-oriented business, it had in common a reliance on externally owned infrastructure, both public and private, that kept Netflix's capital outlay for distribution relatively modest. After pivoting towards digital streaming, beginning the service in 2007 and infamously separating it from its DVD business in 2012, Netflix became hungry for content, eventually moving into media production. And it is here that the capital investments for a company historically able to keep its costs as a minimum dramatically spiked. So it's important, however, to recognize the inherent weaknesses of Netflix's growth strategy, which become increasingly apparent as the company's growth ambitions scale into global proportions. First, Netflix has relied on massive debt financing to fuel its emergence, and even more so to fund its massive expansion, the expansion of production capacity. Between 2011 and 2021, so in that decade, Netflix, nicknamed Debtflix by skeptics, borrowed $15 billion, which is just an incredible amount of money, right? Mostly through junk bonds to fund its evolving model. While quarterly profits after 2021 suggested that new revenue streams have made further borrowing no longer necessary, most of this debt remains on the balance sheet, although it's very cleverly hidden by accounting practices. While subscriber growth has slowed, and in 2022, in fact, contracted. Critics have suggested that Netflix's proclaimed profitability is an accounting illusion, depending on the aggressive amortization of content costs. Secondly, in 2022, Netflix had relied almost exclusively on the subscriber growth in order to expand, but because, again, until very recently, because it refused to sell advertisements on its platform, Netflix growth could only be driven by either an expansion of the subscriber base or else an increased prices. Just to kind of contrast it, it didn't have something like Disney, right, where it had like theme parks, or Apple that had other, like there was a kind of where the streaming model kind of helps and is tied into these other businesses. It just has streaming, right? Early on, there was plenty of room for growth because of relatively low levels of market penetration, but increasingly markets have become more saturated and competition from rival platforms has intensified. So in this context, Netflix finds itself increasingly squeezed. So when I first delivered the initial version of this paper at a conference, actually that was on Netflix Korea at Seoul National University last year in April, skepticism about the Netflix's future growth prospects might have seemed overly pessimistic. In fact, I was the only one being pessimistic about this. It was kind of remarkable about the way in which, I mean, for good reason, I guess, like shows like Squid Game and other Kingdom or whatever being kind of intensely celebrated, and scholars were generally more interested in trying to understand the phenomena in terms of, its global spread and why it had been successful. But so I was the sort of lone, Debbie Downer in the room, I guess. But upon the release of its quarterly report just a few weeks later, the major cracks in its operations were exposed. The company reported a decline in subscribers for the first time in a decade, a terrible sign for a growth model entirely dependent on subscription growth. The stock market, the stock closed down 35% on the news in the immediate aftermath, falling even further thereafter, eliminating $50 million of market capitalization. causing the company to engage in some reevaluation of its most time-honored practices. And though this downturn was partly a short-term correction for the streaming boom during COVID-19, when demand for services like Netflix spiked, the fundamental problem standing in the way of Netflix's future growth prospects also came into clear focus. The early 20th century has, of course, been a golden age of Korean media production, and the cautionary note sounded in this paper may seem unwarranted given the scale of success. BTS, Parasite, Squid Game. We only need to mention the names to indicate the remarkable achievement of Korean content producers in these decades. But this golden age has also coincided with a good deal of economic uncertainty for South Korea and a transitioning global economy moving away from US dominance. As an export-dependent economy in an environment in which some of the world's largest economies are becoming more protective and trade disputes more common, think Brexit or the US-China trade war, South Korea finds itself in a newly uncertain position. Economists have sounded warning bells about a South Korean economy moving away from its period of rapid industrial development and the possibility of secular stagnation in the model of the Japanese experience in the 1990s. What Netflix as a company and South Korea as an economy have in common at this point in their reflective historical trajectories is that they both have a need at this juncture to explore extroverted strategies, export strategies, expansion strategies, of expanding into unfamiliar markets in order to expand their customer bases. South Korea became an export-dependent economy in the last decades of the 20th century and cannot rely on the protective shelter of a large domestic market as other global economic powerhouses have during this transitioning, this early 21st century transition. We might thus draw an analogy between South Korea's need to grow external markets and Netflix's need to grow its subscriber base under conditions in which the hegemonic power underwriting these necessary expansions has significantly weakened, that is the US empire. Both imply extroverted business models that require sustained market expansion in increasingly unfamiliar markets in an environment of diminishing returns to fuel the needed growth coming at precisely at a historical moment when that extroverted model bucks the global trend towards protectionist inclinations. And in the larger paper, there's this whole section about Jonghyun's notion of platform imperialism, and I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A, but it's had to kind of cut it out for the interest of time here. Furthermore, expansion into international markets invariably comes with a host of local, logistical, and regulatory problems that can threaten the entire operation. An early indication of the challenges of Netflix Korea operations was a lawsuit filed by SK Broadband. So SK Broadband is one of the largest internet providers in South Korea. And this is a lawsuit in late 2021. And the lawsuit charged that Netflix was taking up an undue portion of the country's network capacity without paying for it directly. So in the fourth quarter of 2021, Netflix Korea accounted for 7.2% of all internet traffic in South Korea. First of all, South Korea is kind of internet obsessed, and that is just a crazy high number. And just to give you a point of comparison, for those of you who know anything about Korean online services, Naver and Kakao, which are just behemoths in South Korea, were 2% and 1% respectively. So Netflix is at 7.2, Naver and Kakao combined are at 3, right? And in addition, both Naver and Kakao made significant annual payments to local internet service providers. So SK demanded that Netflix pay fees like these other companies to pay for increased capacity. But Netflix argued that broadband was a public utility akin to the postal service on which it built its initial DVD business and thus did not require payment. SK prevailed in Korean courts in early 2022, though the case was appealed, and I believe it's still currently pending. I have to go back and check. I'm not positive about that. But the case is crucial. You can see why the case is crucial to Netflix's global strategy. A loss would not only significantly hurt the company's bottom line in Korea and globally, but perhaps more importantly, would offer a model for broadband providers all over the world to demand similar payments. Currently, Netflix is holding firm in international markets, frequently advocating for the altruistic goal of net neutrality as cover for its own interests, and for good reason. Netflix dependence on network infrastructure that it does not own becomes more of a problem the more it expands into global markets, indicating a larger problem about the limits of its power as it meets requirements for growth that its business model is predicated on. It also indexes the extent to which a digital platform owns only a tiny fraction of the infrastructure required for its success and propagation. Even though Netflix is universally regarded as a dominant player in global media at present, we see that its position atop this hierarchy is precarious, resting as it does on free access to an expansive infrastructure that, again, it does not own. It's not surprising in this context that many of Netflix's Korea's most successful shows have been preoccupied with the notion of survival amidst catastrophic and even apocalyptic circumstances. And I guess I'm trying to think of these shows less as corporate allegory per se and more a reflection of culture, and specifically Netflix culture, which I'm extending, again, not just the culture that it claims to have, like it's corporate logics, but also the conditions for growth, right? So for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to focus on Kingdom, which was the crucial IP that paved the way for Netflix's Korea's most recent success, including Squid Game. Kingdom begins with the story of a kingdom in a crisis of succession, with an undead zombie king propped up in the throne by a powerful minister. Lord Hakju, by bidding his time until the minister's daughter, the queen's consort, can give birth to a legitimate heir. And interested more broadly in the health of his nation, this is where I sort of began. The crown prince Yi Chang, the king's illegitimate son, does eventually take measures to secure the throne for himself, but his actions are motivated less by a hunger for power and more virtuously by a desire to save his nation for both the zombie contagion and oligarchic greed that plague it. As previously discussed, he finally resolves the problem of succession at the end of the second season by abdicating his claim to the infant who everyone believes to be the king's legitimate son, except for the crown prince, who knows he's actually the son of his deceased bodyguard. We should perhaps, however, backtrack to the end of season 1. Here, the decision by Yi Chang in the second season's finale to apply the keeper test to himself is anticipated by a keeper test that he applies to the magistrate of Sangsu, where when that magistrate decides to close the doors of the fortress and let the people outside trying to flee the zombie plague die. Prince Yi Chang tells the magistrate, "You are no longer qualified to run this place. I cannot let everyone die because of an incompetent official." All right, so that's the keeper test. With this decision in place, Prince Yi Chang leads an effort to defend the fortress against the zombie hordes that's on its way. Operating under the assumption that the zombies only come out at night and that they seem to fear fire and water, Yi Chang orders preparations, and the makeshift army he assembles wait anxiously through the night for the zombies to arrive. When morning comes, they are relieved, only to have that relief upset by the belated arrival of the zombies in the light of day as they have let their guard down. We learn thereafter that it's not daylight that determines the emergence of zombies, but cold temperatures. The revelation of this knowledge is the crucial twist at the end of season 1. And I would suggest that what it narrates is a kind of pivot that is ultimately analogous to the two great pivots in the history of Netflix that I described earlier. First, the pivot towards streaming, and more recently, the pivot towards content production. What the end of Kingdom Season 1 articulates then is something like the rules of the game suddenly changing, forcing decision makers to adapt to chaotically shifting certain conditions. And it's precisely such moments of pivot that Netflix culture, with its emphasis on nimble decision-making, is imagined to be so crucial. So as I've suggested, Kingdom is a show about culture. More than simply a drama of determining a new monarch at a moment of crisis, Kingdom is concerned with the entailments of such a transition. And I'm thinking, in this respect, it's very similar to the HBO show Succession in a lot of ways, right? It's about the crisis of succession. The show builds towards the climax of its second season by looking closely at the different potential leaders of the kingdoms and the various alternatives. The first two, Lord Cho and Queen Consort, proved to be driven by self-interest, the desire for familiar prosperity, and the pure greed of the pair driving their actions. The Queen Consort poisons her father when he learns that the infant is not in reality her son and thus not a worthy member of the Haewon Cho clan. Willing to destroy the kingdom if he cannot keep power, the queen consort recklessly releases the zombies that Lord Cho had been keeping in the prison, a palace prison to study. But in contrast, Prince Yi Chang leads a coalition of autonomous actors who are guided less by his authority than the power of his logic. Crucially, the entire finality of season 2 with its carnage occurs behind the locked gates of the palace, right? And it's an inside the house phenomena, right? It's not happening in the kingdom, it's happening in the palace in particular, as if to emphasize the drama of what is ultimately an internal leadership battle, which of course ends with Prince Chang's keeper test. Yi Chang's keeper test. So at stake in the succession battle in Kingdom entails a profound culture shift. In this context, the zombie king's affliction signals his ill-conceived affinity to the powerful Hewon Cho clan. In the first episode of season 1, Lord Cho has a group of court scholars executed for their support of the crown prince. And as an expression of this support, these scholars have posted around a city a sign proclaiming the death of the king and, quote, "a new wind will blow." Forced to reckon with their actions and the torture before Cho, the scholars reveal that they're motivated not just by an allegiance to the crown prince, but more so to shift the priorities that he represents in a kingdom that has become dominated by an elite class who exploit a starving population. In short, they want a culture change. And this is precisely what they get at the end of season 2. The drama of a low-born crown prince deferring to an even lower-born rival registers in the conflict of Netflix's anti-hierarchical ethos. But even in the first episode, we get a sense of what this new wind might mean. We meet Mu Young, the crown prince's bodyguard. He's there on the left there, and the real father of the next king. The crown prince asks him to retrieve the journal from the royal infirmary that would clarify the king's malady. And to convince him to risk the danger, the crown prince reveals that he knows that Mu Young had been surreptitiously taking food from him, that is the crown prince, to aid the health of his pregnant wife. And though the crown prince is certainly using this knowledge as a lever, it's also clear that he's approved of this action and that he's concerned about the well-being of his friend and his friend's family. Even when Mu Young betrays him, controlled as he is by the Hewon clan, who in turn control the well-being of his wife, the crown prince holds him fondly as Mu Young dies in his arms and weeps over his death. The crown prince's final decision to install Mu Young's son as king is a final expression of affection for his friend. After all, friendship, like entertainment, is a fundamental human need. So although the motivation for this decision certainly extends beyond this affection, these broader motivations might also be encompassed under the rubric of friendship as expressed in the Netflix culture statement. Indeed, the love of his actual friend, Mu Young, dovetails in this moment with the anti-hierarchical network notion of friendship implied in the Netflix document. His decision enacts a major culture shift benefiting the embattled subjects of the kingdom in rejecting the power of the Hewon Cho clan, even though everyone believes the infant king to be the son of the queen. And indeed, we can think of the drama as an articulation of this cultural ethos in broader terms. But if Kingdom is utopian in its desire to repair a culture in which excessive inequality makes progress difficult, it also offers us a nightmare vision of anti-hierarchical culture in the spectacle of the zombie horde. We should emphasize here that the flat network is not just a model for Netflix culture, it is also the principle of its business model, which requires a continual expansion of its subscriber base to sustain its growth. While zombies have become a defining trope of contemporary popular culture and are often associated with the various ailments of late capitalism, Kingdom reaches back in time for something more foundational in contrast to these more apocalyptic orientations. With the king himself as the origin point of this disease, the pre-modern interest here is in a contradiction that infects the core of the kingdom. The disease is not at the periphery, but at the center. For Netflix, then, there's no better metaphor than a zombie plague to express its anxiety regarding a subscription business model that requires the contagion-like spread of its platform into untapped markets, without which the company cannot survive. Significantly, the popularity of Kingdom had a significant impact on Netflix's subscriber base, increasing the number of Netflix Korea subscribers from 1.27 million to over 2 million in just one single month, anticipating the almost $900 million impact that Squid Game would bring to the platform just a few years later. But to continually succeed, Netflix needs to expand at the rate of a zombie plague. Even as those resulting hordes beg the question about the sustainability of the model. For Netflix, the primary source of its nourishment, expanding its subscriber base, is also the site of its vulnerability. We see this dyad plainly in the first episode of Kingdom, where Sobi returns to her clinic from gathering medicinal herbs to find the formerly starving patients are eating a hearty meal, their spirits lifted by the food. The tiger hunter, Jonghyun, tells Sobi that he had hunted a deer for the meal, but she later discovers that he had actually used recently deceased human corpse that had been infected with the disease. So the scene of happy eating then turns to tragedy, with all the patients turning into zombies since the corpse had been inflicted. This quick oscillation from the simple pleasures of social reproduction, all these people enjoying a meal, in one moment, to the horror of contagion in the next, indexes the razor's edge on which both Netflix's business model and South Korea's export economy rests, both needing to exponentially grow external markets in which the hegemonic power underwriting these necessary expansions has significantly weakened. Kingdom is an account of this basic need and the anxieties that this need produces, both of which shape the contours of Netflix Korea's platform culture. What Netflix and South Korean popular culture ultimately have in common is that both are responses aimed at managing crises within late capitalism, whether we are speaking at the scale of a declining industry, like American legacy media, or at the scale of a national economy, as in the case of South Korea in its post-industrial moment. While both can be seen as success stories when viewed within smaller frames as weaker competition is vanquished, the reasons for optimism become troubled in the grander scheme, in which one worries about the dependence on continual expansion when prospects for continual expansion become increasingly limited. What are we to make of models in which the ideal rate of growth can only be attained by zombie hordes? This is a precarious kingdom indeed. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. If we were all unmuted, you'd probably hear applause from all of us. So let me propose, since we have about 26 people participating, I think we can be polite enough to unmute ourselves individually when you'd like to ask a question. If that doesn't work, then we'll resort to raising hands.
Stop sharing.
Questions or comments?
Donna.
Donna.
Yeah, I have a question in terms of maybe future directions from Netflix, and those of us who are interested in transnational cinema. Do you think that there's a turn away from this nimbleness that is for Netflix to become, at least what I've been saying, looking for those tent poles? I think South Korea is an example of it, but I work primarily in Latin America, and the history was that they funded projects such as 3% with all new directors and gave them creative abilities. And what I've been seeing recently is movies, let's say Bardo, that's now up, big bucks aimed at cons, major directors. And I'm just wondering, do you perhaps see this as the next pivot?
Yeah, I guess the way I read that is because the model has certainly changed, specifically in the last year, and the model has changed because of profit pressure, right? And that, like, the model of, like, the way they were talking about subscription growth, they were talking about, doubling their subscriber base or triple. I mean, they were still talking in those terms until very recently. So I don't think of the recent changes as necessarily a pivot, but I think of it as this kind of moment as of like a tightening squeeze. Like it's the same kind of forces that are that have been sort of latent, but now have to be actually reckoned with for a publicly traded company that has to account for profits. So I think the kind of changes that I think, first of all, there's a smaller scale. They're investing in fewer things, and it's logical in that context that they're going to choose things like, you know, Bardo over taking flyers on 50 different shows. And I think it comes from the same place that the new advertising and the new emphasis on advertising, and also on eliminating accounts that have like multiple subscribers. Like, I think that's all kind of coming from the same place. There's a kind of new accountability towards profits in the context of understanding that the model of like exponential growth is actually probably no longer on the table. So whether we think, I'm not sure if that's a qualitative pivot in the sense that there's a kind of new direction. I'm more inclined to think that this is just the screws kind of tightening, and a kind of logical response to those kinds of conditions.
Great. Do we have any more questions? I don't see any raised hands.
Joe, you, oh, there. Amiko, in minute?
Hi, I don't mean to interrupt, William.
No, please, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Joe. This was very interesting. I teach Kingdom alongside other Netflix and streaming dramas that are historical. So one of my first question is, I have several, but trying to formulate some in a coherent way quickly. So the first one is about genre. This historical genre is very popular. And people have commented on why. What is the significance of a historical drama that's loosely located in Korean history? I know it takes a lot of liberties, and obviously it's a zombie drama as well. But in light of the popularity of this genre as a Netflix franchise, so that's one thing. And the other one is, I really like the allegorical reading. As an allegory of capitalism, that what I would like you to explain perhaps to me is the discrepancy between how Netflix sees capitalism and the limited opportunities for growth for a company, and specifically for the leadership at the top, as you so well described, and the viewers themselves, and perhaps Netflix's calculation of these viewers' sense of capitalist crisis, which is those are two very different views. I guess Netflix would not calculate that viewers in South Korea or elsewhere would be sensitive to, numbers and growth on Netflix's charts. So how do those calculations converge in the content itself as an allegory?
Okay, so I think I need a clarification on the second one, but let me just handle the first one. I have a hard time keeping two things in my head at once. So in terms of the genre question, this is a really, this kind of historical drama, is a really popular genre in Korean media, right? But yet, like this kind of the author of this, the writer and developer of Kingdom was she's a young writer, and she also did Signal, the TVN show Signal, which was a big hit. And she's kind of known for these sort of like, hybridic, kind of clever formulations. But she brought the show to Netflix because she believed that it wasn't popular to do in existing Korean media. That actually it was only something like Netflix Korea that would take a chance on this kind of weird hybrid. That's something that didn't quite fit the genre would work. And obviously she was successful in that. So I mean, I think that and I think you see that with other at least shows at Netflix Korea. I can't speak to that globally, but there's a way in which the kind of genre calculation, and this is like deep within the DNA of the company as well. I don't know if you remember the early days of the Netflix streaming service, which was much more driven by genre categories than it is now. Like the categories, and they were very like kind of hilariously specific. It would be like, historical dramas with a strong female lead, and based on your and it would sort of the algorithm would try to sort of figure out these kinds of very specific genres and target them. I mean, I think that's no longer the case in the current system of organization. For the second question, can you just repeat the two parts that you want to sort of articulate the relationship between?
Yeah, sorry, I overcomplicated. So what you described, as I understand, if I understand it correctly, is a corporate allegory.
Yes.
So Netflix created a drama that's about its own anxieties as a company, or specifically its leaders' anxieties about limited growth in the global market, which would not, I don't know how that would directly translate into content that they want to sell to regular people who just want to watch a zombie drama.
Yeah.
Their sense of, I see the connection in a sense of crisis, capitalist crisis, but the view from the ground of the viewer who logs into the Netflix catalog is very different from those of the insiders who are familiar with corporate culture.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. That's great. So the part of the essay that I've kind of minimized or kind of cut out was to think. So before thinking at the level of the consumer and why this would appeal, I first need to think the larger scales beyond the corporate, right? And so what this paper tries to do is align a couple different contexts for crisis. So first, the kind of crisis in the film legacy film and media, right? And you see this all the time, particularly exacerbated after COVID, but just the declining profits in Hollywood studios, the problems that American network television has had. So there's that level of crisis, which I think you could see in this paper. The second level is just sort of the national economy that I'm talking about, specifically relative to South Korea, which is one of these sort of post-war booming industrial economies that experienced this period of rapid growth. In Korea, it's often described as a compressed modernity. And then that end of that period of industrial expansion, and then a need to kind of maintain those profits. And if you look at Korean GDP growth, it's contracted year after year since about the 1990s. And many economists think that it will follow, or there's a fear that it will follow in the Japanese lost decade model, right? It's kind of period of stagnation, right? So there's a kind of national crisis, and that specifically what connects those two, Netflix and the national crisis, is both that the solution seems to be in both cases expansion, right? Korea is an export economy. I think it's like 80% export. And it needs to kind of go elsewhere in order to kind of sustain the prosperity that was developed in the earlier kind of industrial moment. And then the third part is a kind of global political economic transition. And here, this is where in the larger paper I talk about platform imperialism, a term from Jonghyun has sort of coined to talk about the influence of streamer or platforms like Netflix globally and its sort of immense power. And my only slight rejoinder, I think it's a useful idea and a useful concept. My only slight rejoinder to it is that this platform imperialism happens at a moment where actual imperialism, namely US imperialism, radically declines. So there's a kind of lack of fit between those two. And there's, the transition, what we talk about when we talk about the transition in, global, political economy and the balance of power, the so-called rise of China, the shift to Asia, et cetera, is this sort of moment of kind of uncertainty that frames, a lot of these other, smaller scale crises. And then, and finally, then to return to the level of the consumer, my suggestion or my implication here is that all of these crises, that they're all kind of indexed towards the same set of problems, and it produces a kind of universalized experience, right? And that not universal in the sense that everybody experiences it the same way, but that Netflix culture, in some ways, the corporate culture, is just another way of stating, indexing these much broader kind of phenomena, right? And that the appeal, I mean, appeal is a tricky thing, right? Like I just, I like noir or whatever, like that's, and therefore I enjoy it. But appeal in this specific way, thinking about why a show like this or like Squid Game would appeal to a global public, for me, has to at least begin with thinking about the way in which the kind of context, for me, it's very much a context of crisis, has this kind of much larger effect and a global effect, right? And so that there is a kind of global public in that regard. And again, I say these things, but I kind of want to back up because I don't want to universalize taste or something like that, right? I just mean to just want to say that there's a kind of through line in these determining coordinates that we see in multiple different scales. Does that get at the question?
Yeah, this is all very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. We have 2 questions. First, Grace Han, and then Julian Stringer.
Hi, I hope you can hear me all right.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. Joseph, thank you so much for your talk. I thought it was really fascinating. And I guess to give some background, I watched Kingdom with my parents in Korea. And I remember when we first saw it as it released, we were like, wow, this is incredible. It was really cool to see something so high production be streamed online / through TV, and for it to be like a foreign production company and everything. And I think that what you're pointing to here, this idea of like cultures, right? Of the corporate culture, but also thinking about the competing like Hallyu versus Cool Japan versus like other soft power cultures, but also thinking about the viral culture that comes with thinking about like this sort of zombie drama within Kingdom is really interesting. But I also kind of want to hear you tease out a little bit more about the zombies themselves, because I think that in and of itself is a really interesting metaphor, right? To think about the cannibalism that comes with the zombies, to think about the dying and the coming alive. And I think also within the vein of some previous hit movies and dramas that have been coming out of Korea at that point, like Train to Busan, or I guess later we have another Netflix drama called All of Us Are Dead, which is based off a webcomic that was released much earlier. And thinking about like this fascination about zombies in particular, and this idea of things coming back alive from the past. I wonder if there is a resonance that might add to your allegory here. And if so, I would love to hear more of your thoughts about that.
So I'll begin with a confession. If like I have if I have a weakness in tendency, it's like my like desire to always like homogenize and show like the kind of the sort of underlying logic that kind of connects everything. But here I really have to kind of resist that impulse and urge. I mean, I think like, there's been a lot of discussion about zombies and, critical discourse. And because I sort of mentioned this in the paper, but there's sort of like a kind of quintessential figure of like capitalism. And they're often described in relationship to surplus population, right? In terms of, labor that is no longer productive, labor that's no longer needed, or marginal figures or marginal communities. I have a graduate student here that talks about its roots in the 19th century in transatlantic slavery, the figure of the zombie, right, in specifically in the Caribbean. And that's kind of usually where that kind of image goes. And so all the things you kind of mentioned, sort of the idea of cannibalism, all the various attributes generally kind of get ascribed to those kinds of coordinates. And I guess what I want to do here is mark the distinctiveness of these zombies, and particularly in this show. I mean, I'm not sure this is the same thing as, this is not like a theory of Korean zombies. Like I don't necessarily have an account of how this might pertain to something like, Busanhaeng or the other, what is it? All of Us Are Dead. Yeah, All of Us Are Dead. But And so the distinctiveness here is that it's the king, like, you know, is the conceit of the show. It's the king, like it's the center. It's the, you know, if this is like, to me, the longer version of this paper makes a lot of comparisons between this and Succession, the HBO Succession, right? It's an in-house zombie, right? It's happening at the core, at the level of leadership. And so for me, then I'm really interested in the way, I mean, like one, and the other kind of distinctiveness, you see this in one of the slides that I show, is one of the questions with the particularity of these zombies in Kingdom is the question of whether to let them in or not, or whether, I mean, there's all these things about gates, of letting things in or keeping things out. And those two things, like keeping things out, and I think of that in relationship to the kinds of things that I've talked about, export economies or whatever. I feel like it's actually a very distinctive case in a lot of ways. So, I mean, I feel like something like Train to Busan is kind of more familiar in a lot of ways. It's the zombie as this kind of external threat that needs to be overcome. It's kind of nuclear family, but actually, like the zombie here speaks to, the most important zombie here is the king, and then by extension, Reed Hastings, right? And so I think it's a very different, it feels like it's a very different kind of case.
Thanks. And I guess just to briefly add on to that, I think it's similar, it resonates with Mr. Sunshine, like this other drama.
Oh, yeah.
Where like the guy who's supposed to be dead comes back and like is like a foreigner, but not a foreigner.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great, that's not a Netflix original, right? That's a licensed, that was licensed.
I believe it's an acquisition.
Yeah. I mean, part of like I'm not sure this is going to be anything bigger than it is right now, but one of the questions I kind of have, like the next kind of question I have for myself, and probably an implicit critique, is what is the relationship between culture and production, right? And like I'm kind of gesture towards the fact that a lot of these shows on Netflix and Netflix originals, particularly coming out of Korea, are similar in their preoccupations, right? So, I kind of shy away from like corporate allegory as such, because I'm not sure I want to make the claim that like Netflix is like the agent of this production, that like Netflix is giving notes and saying, make this more like, can you put the keeper test in the show? Or, can you make this more about our culture? I think it's more a kind of indirect thing where the culture, culture as such is something that infects, to use take the zombie plague even further, kind of everything, right? And there's a way in which, it's non-hierarchical. The whole Netflix culture is non-hierarchical, but it still does the things that the hierarchy that it does exist at Netflix wants, right? And so the kind of the question of agency is a complicated one and an interesting one, so one that I'm still kind of thinking through.
Julian, I want to give you a chance to speak, but first I want to ask Nicole, how are we doing on time?
I don't know. It's 1.
There seem to be a lot of people still interested. Can we go past?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't think that we will be cut off. That'll be kind of tragic, but I think it's okay. So Julian, are you there? With your question?
He's unmuted.
Yes.
Julian?
I hear but all I heard was
Okay.
Well, if you can't, if there's some problem, maybe if you can also type it in the chat, we could also go that way. And I see here, Gina Marchetti had to leave, but wrote, I wonder too about the Cold War allegorical potential of your reading. Some of the themes seem to resonate with North-South Korean geopolitics too. And I guess that's something also that you're talking about, that this has a larger reach. This allegory is more fluid. Right, Joe?
Yeah. I mean, I wish I could say, oh, I'm glad you asked that. I have, it's, you can see it here and here in the film. I mean, of course, the Cold War, the North-South conflict relations is always kind of like haunting Korean dramas, but I don't really have like a kind of a specific account of how it works here, except to say that a lot of this, the sort of hegemonic model, U.S. centered model emerges in the post-war, in the sort of post-war effort by the United States to gain influence and allies in Asia, East Asia.
I'm sorry, I see another raised hand. Jiwon, did I see that?
Yes.
Oh,
Sorry,
wonderful.
I cannot show. Actually, I'll show you my face. I'm digging out of the snow.
Oh no!
So I look like this. So I better not show you my face. But my question is, Kim Eun-hee, who wrote Kingdom, said she wrote the whole series 10 years ago.
Yes.
But none of the producers could produce it because it was too graphic. And especially the main point was that zombies had to be beheaded to be destroyed, but that couldn't be made or broadcast through regular broadcasting companies. So she had to wait 10 years until she found Netflix, which is a good compromise for that. The same with Squid Game. Hwang
that's right.
Dong-hyuk wrote 10 years ago the script, and he couldn't find anyone who would produce that because of the graphic violence and graphic quality of many other aspects of the film until he found Netflix. So it seems like Netflix is becoming a kind of haven for people who would like to produce something that's more up to date in terms of graphic nature of representation of sex and violence. What do you make of that?
Yeah, well, it's clearly true, right? I mean that I think there but it's not just. I guess it's part of a larger phenomenon thinking about the relationship between streamers and then network television, right? Even cable, right? And the kinds of audiences that both address. I guess I would say, though, I would want to say, to complicate it a little bit, right? That you're right that both have these scripts that they can't produce until Netflix comes around. But I also think that the actual production matters as well, right? That I don't think these are kind of discrete things that are just like realized according to the original vision. I think it matters when they're produced within the context of Netflix. And that one thing that actually both producers, the terms they use is freedom. They actually, in interviews, they talk about the culture of freedom at Netflix. And that's actually in the culture deck. Like that's actually like one of the rubrics within the culture deck, right? And so I think you're right. I think that part of the appeal of Netflix to certain creatives, creators and content creators in Korea is the kind of sense of freedom in terms of like what can be represented on screen and what can't, and the relative freedom they have there. But I think that freedom is also framed within the idea of freedom, which is a really important kind of cultural point for Netflix in terms of its corporate culture as well.
We have Julian's question now. My mic doesn't seem to be working. My question is about Netflix branding. Given the company's ambivalent status as production agent, how important do you think branding the company is to Netflix reaching, e.g. the South Korean market and customers, or is branding not as important to Netflix as it might be to, say, Disney?
That's a really interesting question because, like, starting with the last, well, first of all, it's an honor to have you here. I have your books right over there on the shelf. And so thank you so much for the question. I'm delighted to be hearing I wish I could hear your voice. I want to start with a comparison to Disney first, because obviously Disney is streamer, but it's also a very, very strong brand, right? Like, I live here in Orange County. Disneyland is just over there. And actually, there's a way in which, I sort of mentioned this a little bit in the talk, there's a way in which the streaming business is a force multiplier of the brand, right? I don't think the brand is it's not unimportant, but it's differently important for Netflix. But I also think there's a kind of ambivalence at Netflix about its own branding. I think it's been a kind of open question at Netflix for a long time, right? Maybe it's because of the corporate culture that aims towards, flexibility and kind of being everything to everyone and everywhere, like this intense kind of global strategy. I remember a few years ago, there was a unsuccessful Netflix show called Hollywoodland, which I found really fascinating because, it was a kind of alternative history of Hollywood where Netflix is like the biggest player in some ways. I mean, it's not literally that, but and it kind of weirdly kind of tells the story of Netflix. It's this story about this actor who's unsuccessful, and he works for an escort service at a gas station, and the escorts there are picked up at the gas station and taken home by by the people that want to sleep with them and pay them for their services. And it's like, the subscription, it's like renting a DVD, sort of getting one for them. I mean, and then, he eventually becomes successful and works in Hollywood. And, the Hollywood studio that's represented there is like, it's like multicultural, it's multiracial, it's like, it accommodates people of different sexualities. And it's a sort of like utopian vision of what Netflix would be like if they ran Hollywood in the 1940s. It was kind of a terrible show, but kind of like fascinating as a result. But to answer the long way to get to the question of branding, in that show, it talks about the actress. There's a dramatization of the actress who jumps off the H in the Hollywoodland sign. I forgot the name of the actress, but so they have the scene, and they don't have enough money to reproduce the Hollywood sign, and so they just have the H. And it just occurred to me, like, oh my God, that's the Netflix N, right? Like, it's, like when you see Netflix pop up, there's the N. So there is this kind of like emphasis on brand. There's just like an attempt to brand and a kind of desire to brand. They definitely have, I believe they're called sonic coins. That sound, that Netflix sound, that boom when you open. That's a kind of a marketing device that a lot of streamers. HBO famously has the HBO song, right? That sort of classical music score before its movies, and has shortened that into a sonic token as well. So it's not that there isn't this effort towards branding. But I think what I see with Netflix is a kind of ambivalence, right? This kind of desire to be a brand, but on the other hand, to like when your business model is like the zombie hordes, like appealing to everyone, right? That kind of like a stabilization of meaning, like in the way that Disney, is family or whatever, or, Marvel like stands for something, is kind of anathema. So there's a kind of like, there's a kind of tension at the center. Branding at Netflix points to a kind of fundamental contradiction and a tension in the business model.
Great. I was thinking about that also as this discussion about Squid Game, about Kingdom, and about how these shows were conceived 10 years earlier, but they were too basically violence for Korean media. Is that correct? And then that's why Netflix then, or this is what we have to go by, is but what the creators have said, and then how that also is the same cry for a global market, right? Is more violence then is more appealing to a global market. It goes hand in hand. Would you say that? I'm wondering.
Sorry, can you repeat that last part? I didn't quite get that last part.
Well, that the Netflix for these showmakers represents a global market in a way that the Korean media that they were working with previously could not. So, but their argument was also that Netflix represented an opportunity to be as graphic as their show design needed to be. So I think that's interesting that that this violence and the global reach go hand in hand.
So
if they do.
I understand what you're saying, but I kind of would want to put the brakes a little bit on a too simple, making those too simply homologous, because I know that, like, you know, Warner Brothers acquired Drama Fever in what is it, 2016, then deplatformed it just prior to Netflix's rise in Korea. And so, I mean, there's always been an effort by Korean media producers to reach global audiences. And in fact, you know, like the kind of Parasite model has been like a kind of dream and ambition for quite some time, right? I think there is something particular about Netflix, but I wouldn't want to sort of too starkly make that division. If I could just kind of address really quickly, there's a great comment here by Jason Scott following up on the brand thing, and I think that's a great. So rather than brand for Netflix, Jason Scott suggests, isn't platform and the algorithm more important than the brand for Netflix? And I think that's a really useful way of thinking about it. And it reminds me of I mentioned in the article, I forgot his name. There's a book called The Platform Economy. In Montreal. I forgot his name. But he talks about platform in a much broader context, and he includes Toyota platforms, which were crucial to Toyotaization, right? And that is like all Toyota cars. I don't know, I'm taking this to be true. I don't know literally, but they're all built on the same platform, right? And that is a kind of model of efficiency. So if you have an SUV or a Camry or whatever, they all have the same kind of platform, and just makes them really nimble, right? They can, you know, they only have to make one kind of platform. They can make all these different kinds of cars. And I would think of that as like sort of analogous to this question, like thinking about how Netflix thinks about brand, right? There's a kind of like core platform there, right? And the platform itself and the algorithm, although the question about the algorithm is a whole other morass. But that's a useful way of thinking about branding there, right? Is something more akin to like a Toyota platform, something that is like connects all of these things, but isn't necessarily an explicit, you know, as explicit of a brand as something like Disney.
Well, especially as they buy so many shows, right? From other producers, correct?
Yeah. I mean,
sorry.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like, and in fact, the model before, I mean, the content production at Netflix is relatively new. For the longest time, it was licensing deals, and those licensing deals just got more and more expensive, and that content production just became a way to kind of like, you know, lower and then control costs. Although there's other like sort of prestige kind of goals as well, like winning an Oscar, so on and so forth. It's Mark Steinberg. That's the book.
Oh, I put the wrong thing down. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah. I also cite that book, which is a fantastic book. But yeah, Mark Steinberg's Platform Economy or something like that.
Okay. Great.
Nikki Lee has been waiting patiently. Nikki, would you like to?
Just a second. I can see whether I can put on my video on. Okay. Hi. First of all, I want to thank. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. I want to thank Joe because thank you for this wonderful talk. Actually, this is really wonderful way for me to wrap up my busy week because I'm looking at the end of my Friday. But I guess you are just starting your Friday.
Yeah, I'm starting. I have a lot of work today.
So, so thank you for that. Also, actually, many people already asked about the questions about Netflix and zombie genres. So my question is more about Korean media industry. So the first question is just if I put it simply, because I don't want to linger on more than needed. Can we think about the if I put it this way, can we think about the fate of Korean media industry being decoupled with the growth framework of Korean national economy? You know what I mean? sorry, because does it make sense to you? Because somehow in my mind, you are putting together the Korean media industry. I mean, putting the Korean media industry in a quite kind of broader framework of
Yeah. Oh, I see.
national economy
I understand.
together. But I don't know. I mean, I'm not a specialist in Korean economy, but I wonder. I mean, if everybody has been following the growth of or the way the Korean media industry has been developing for the last 2 decades or 3 decades, I wonder whether it's possible to think about the fate of Korean media industry a little bit with a little bit distance from the maybe the longer term frame of the development of Korean economy in some sense.
I see. I understand. Okay.
And in relation to this, the second question is the relationship between Korean media industry and Netflix. So surely, I think Netflix has opened a lot of opportunities for many actually Korean creative directors and screenwriters. But at the same time, somehow I think Netflix seems to take advantage of the actually, if I put it this way, the global rising global recognition of Korean media contents as well. Especially, I'm not sure about the USA, but for example, the Korean media industry has really become if I put it this way, if I exaggerate a little bit, it has become the mainstream media contents in many countries, especially in Asia, for example. Then I think, can we think about actually Netflix is rather kind of taking this advantage of that kind of, the the potential or the already established kind of global status of Korean media contents. And in that way, can we think, of course, Netflix, working with Netflix can provide a kind of critical momentum for the Korean media industry, but perhaps it won't be anything really totally decisive. So, so if I put it this way, if I think about in terms of the platform economy, so Netflix can be just one platform, Korean media industry just getting into at certain stage. I mean, I hope it makes sense.
Yes. Okay. So the two questions, like I said before, I have trouble like keeping two things in my head at once.
Sorry.
No. So with the first one was about disarticulating what's happening, in the media industry from what's happening in Korean political economy. And I think that's right. I mean, I think that's an important kind of, corrective to this in an account. I guess I would describe it as a kind of emphasis, right? That what I want to do is kind of emphasize. I mean, I neither want to say that Korean media is absolutely determined by Korean political economy, nor do I want to say that it's absolutely independent of it, right? It's somewhere obviously in the middle, and a kind of all-encompassing model is too stringent. My kind of tact has been to kind of emphasize the connection between the two, because I think it's has been, in my mind, underappreciated the extent to which there's a kind of connection. And then, you know, like in my book, I talk about that famous, like it's like too often cited these days, but the famous moment where Kim Young Sam thinks, like, watches Jurassic Park and compares it to the production of Hyundai automobiles, that Jurassic Park outsells like the sort of foreign sales of Hyundai automobiles. But that's also a really important kind of moment, because that's the moment where actually Korean content production media, specifically film in that case, becomes actually a state enterprise, right? That it's subsidized by the state, right? And so there's an extent to which it grows well beyond those terms, right? But I think it's actually very distinctive to think about it in relationship to that particular history and that arrives, you know, at a moment where the impetus behind that isn't just like, oh, there's this other opportunity. It's this pressure because of the sort of like slowing of industrial growth in the 1980s, right? So these things kind of are related, and part of the effort in this work is to try to think about those relations and how they're articulated. In terms of Korean media versus Netflix media and the various efforts by Korean media, I think that's a great point. And, you know, I think that actually fits the argument that I'm trying to give here, that like once, you know, another problem with Netflix's growth strategy is that once it kind of models for local industries, like what's possible with their content and what, and, you know, for their audiences, you know, this was a really popular show in Korea as well. It's immediately, you know, attracts imitators or people that can do things the same or better. Right. And I think about, I love this story. I remember a number of years ago where Uber wanted to open up in Korea. And I think the story goes, I'm not sure if this is apocryphal or not, but they were just sort of said like that, you know, the pitch was heard and they said no, but then like, you know, it was just like the model was just copied, right? And done in a different and sort of better way for the Korean audience. It's a similar kind of dynamic here. What Netflix is doing isn't like, as much as it wants to talk about its proprietary algorithm or whatever, it's not rocket science, right? It's, you know, it's easily imitable. And what's not imitable is the scale at which it can happen, right? And so once that scale becomes apparent, I think there's all sorts. I know, for example, like if you take it from the other side, I talked to, I know the CEO for CJ America here, and, you know, they had licensing deals with Netflix, right? But they're also working on their own, you know, platform. And those two things aren't in conflict with one another. Like they could start with licensing and learn about how that business works and what's successful and what's not. And then CJ is obviously a huge corporation that can produce and compete and maybe perhaps defeat Netflix in the Korean market, right? And so these are what you're pointing to is an important aspect of like actually a further challenge to this kind of platform imperialism that Netflix absolutely needs, right, in order to grow.
Well, we are coming close to 1:30, which is when I think we're going to be signing off. Joe, you've been extremely gracious in staying with us. And if you've had a chance to look at the chat room, you've got all kinds of appreciative comments.
A little bit of it, yeah.
Yeah, are you going to be at the SCMS conference?
You know, unfortunately, I have a conflict. I'm supposed to give a talk. SUNY Buffalo is doing a Korean studies conference, and I'm supposed to give it a keynote.
Oh, okay.
So unfortunately, it's the same weekend. In fact, and my wife's a film scholar, so she's going to SCMS, and I'm going to Buffalo.
I did want to give you a chance to say something about your last book, Vicious Cycles, because some of us didn't get a chance to read the introduction, and it just looks so rich.
I mean, I guess just very quickly that I think a lot of this work on Netflix is coming out of the sort of thinking that I tried to work through in Vicious Circuits, and it's very much about it's a scalar argument in a similar kind of way. It's thinking about Korean film production in the immediate aftermath of the IMF crisis, and thinking about the IMF crisis as a pivot from smaller, that is, national economies to global economies. And that moment of film that sort of culminates in a lot of ways with the Oscar victory of Parasite speaks, I think, to this moment of global transition. I also have a book on Bong Joon-ho that's about that should come out the next year.
Oh,
So I'm still waiting to hear the reader reports for that. But this is that I think of these things as part of like a, I don't know, like a trilogy of sorts. They're all kind of, and the next work that I'm doing is something very different. But
okay.
Thinking about these.
Who's publishing the next book?
Oh, there's a University of Illinois has a series called Contemporary Film Directors, and it's
Yes.
on that series.
Great. We'll look for that.
Evelyn Shiz here, so shout out to Evelyn. Her work too.
Okay, well, thanks again, Joe. I'll give you a rest. You've been going nonstop for an hour and a half.
Thank you so much. It was a great talk and a great paper. So thank you very, very much. Very
Thank you
illuminating.
so much for having me. I'm really honored, and it was fun. So no problem at all.
And yeah, I think it should be more than an article because there's so much going on with Netflix in Korea. So I hope you continue investigating this.
I mean, the reason why I would struggle to make it more in the article is, and I mentioned this in the article version, it's Netflix is like almost impossible to study, even more than like something like Warner Brothers. Like it's like they don't do things like corporate write-downs of flops, their accounting is very, and they have like NDAs for former employees. So it's actually really hard to, getting into, like, the reason why the Kingdom reading is useful in this case is because of kind of a lack of other ways in, right? I mean, it's like actually kind of the best reflection of Netflix culture that you can find. But yeah, they're very, as Evan points out, they're very mysterious about their numbers.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Just want to give Evelyn a chance since she's the last one. Maybe she's holding on to say hi to Joe.
Hi.
Hi.
I signed on late, so it's totally my fault, but
No worries. I just saw your name floating around though. I just wanted to. I said there's a lot of familiar names on the.
Yeah, well, I hope they show up in the, if not in the chat room, on the recording, which we'll be making available pretty soon. Evelyn, did you get the notice for this through the SIG?
yeah, through the SIG.
Oh,
Yes.
good. Okay, good. You're still part of that.